the territory of being a software developer is having to onboard and learn how to navigate around new code bases, sometimes quite often throughout your career. It can also be very hard to get up to speed in a code base that you didn't write the original version of. So how can you learn to read and understand other people's code, especially in large code bases that have various levels of complexity and a lot of different features or business domains? That's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Hi, my name is Gwen, and welcome back to Faraday Academy. This is another video on advice for software developers, and especially developers who are newer or just getting into the field. This is a video that I have been wanting to make on my channel for quite a while, and I have been back and forth on what to include in this video and what advice to give. I feel like every year or so, as I get more experience myself, I improve my processes for being able to pick up and understand a new code base quickly. So I just want to share a lot of my tips and thoughts on these things in this video. I hope you find this helpful. I've talked to quite a few people over the last few years about this very topic. What is the best and most efficient way or ways that I can pick up and become productive in a new code base and a new ecosystem quickly, sometimes even in a new language or a new framework that I need to learn for a role or for a new job. I want to start this video off by passing on some advice that I've received in the past, and that is to become like an investigator in the new code base I'm diving into. And as an investigator, I am trying to discover the context and the inner workings of the code base. Now, in order to do my research and investigation properly, I need to have a plan. So I have a list of things that I try to roughly go through every time I dive into a new project or code base. The very first thing is that I try to learn the business logic and any information about the product that I can before I even touch the code. I know at some companies, they push developers to be productive and maybe even make a PR in the first day or first few days. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I have found it much more helpful and productive in the long run to spend quite a bit of time upfront in the first week or two, especially learning the business and domain logic for the product or products. A great way to start with product knowledge is getting a 10,000 foot overview of the application and how users actually use your application. So I think there's two things that need to both happen in this phase. One, a software developer or technical person should show you the application and how it works from their perspective. But it's also really important to see how your client or how your users are using the application. If it's an internal product, then ask to schedule time with the users on the teams that are the end users of the tools that you are building. If it's a client-facing application, then most companies will have client demos or recorded sales calls or customer calls. They might even have an application like Full Story, where you can see screen recordings of how customers are actually using your application. I think all of the above are excellent things to do and to start to dive into in the first week you're at a new company. If you have a customer experience team or a team that is directly dealing with the customers on a day-to-day basis, especially if they're the ones onboarding new customers and helping show new customers around the application, they can also be a great resource for you. And you can ask if you can sit on some of their calls with customers so you can learn exactly from their perspective and also from a customer's perspective. Now, this goes along with the last point but at the same time, you should be learning all of the different pieces of the application and what different kinds of users interact with your application. If the company doesn't set you up with test accounts right away, and most companies who have a defined onboarding process will do this, will give you some kind of a developer account where you can log in and have some level of permissions in the production application. If they don't do that, you should ask for it upfront. And also try to get a test account for each type of user. For example, if you are building a learning management system for schools, then you should get a test account for maybe an admin user as well as a teacher and also a student, and maybe if there are other types of roles as well. These test accounts should allow you to really get in there and make CRUD operations or changes anywhere without breaking the production application, without accidentally changing any client data. They should be completely isolated, and if they're connected to any other accounts, they should only be connected to other accounts that are also test users. If the company has documentation on business logic, user stories, or any of those types of high-level or overview documentation, that's a really good thing to look at as well, to go along with what you are learning in demos and client interviews, and then getting an overview of the code base from people, and also diving into actually using the application yourself. So the second thing that I recommend is diving into the tech stack. This is usually something that I will do before I start a project, or especially work at a new company. I will get as much information as possible about any languages, frameworks, important libraries, and also third-party tools and integrations that the company uses for whatever application or applications that I will be working on. Now, sometimes the interviewers don't always get it exactly right, or don't always get the tech stack and libraries exactly right. But if you can get the information from a tech lead or one of the senior developers on the team, I find those are the best resources to find out exactly what technologies they are currently using at the moment and what's important for me to learn. As a professional, I've mentioned this before in my videos, but I like to be prepared going into a project. So if I need to brush up on a language or get a basic understanding of a new framework or something like that, I try to do that before I start, which also helps reduce my anxiety about starting a new job or a new consulting role. Now, once I start at the new company, I try to figure out right away who to ask about what. So there will be certain people on the team or in the company who have certain knowledge about different areas of the code base and also domain expertise about different areas of the product. And I make a list of who all those people are and who to go to with what type of questions. That helps me get the best information possible and also helps me spread out my questions so I feel like I'm not bothering any one person too much. Learning the tech stack is really a precursor for step 3, which is finally diving into the code base. Now, the first important point I want to make here is that it is so important to find the space and block off the time to do deeply focused work when first learning and onboarding into a new code base. I really don't think there's any way around that if you want to onboard and jump in and be productive quickly. It's important to turn off all distractions and get in that focused mode and have the time blocked off for at least a few hours where you know you don't have any meetings or anything every single day. A few tools that I like to use to help with this are whiteboards and mind maps. And usually I'll draw the mind map on a whiteboard, though I do have a software tool that I happen to use sometimes for mind maps as well. That helps me visualize and slow down and think about the code as I'm going along, and also gives me an understanding about relationships that I can review as I'm going along so I don't forget. From the previous sections, you should already kind of know the main groupings of the application, especially if you have logged in and actually used the application and seen the demos of the application yourself. I think it's helpful to very briefly find those sections. Where are the models for each section located? Where are the related API endpoints, and how is the folder structure organized? And then look at the front end components as well, just very briefly at first. I think that's helpful to kind of get the lay of the land, or the high level overview, and how the code base is organized to help understand. The second thing I like to do when I'm diving into the code is look into the build system. This is especially easy if they're using a standard system, like most companies using something like Docker now. So I find the Docker files and then any other configuration files, and I can learn a lot of information about the product, or the project, from those files. The next thing I look at are the dependencies. Sometimes in a microservices architecture, or when working with just multiple applications, there will be multiple dependency files. So even when I think I know about the tech stack, the libraries, the frameworks that are being used, I will find out more information or new information. The next thing I look at after that is the database. So I try to get in ERD, if they have one already, in a tool like Lucidchart, or generated by some kind of a SQL client, that's great. If not, I try to use a tool to generate it myself. They have some free GitHub repositories that do this, and a lot of SQL clients do it as well. Sometimes I find this step to be super helpful, looking at the relationships and trying to see what tables exist. Sometimes it's a little bit less helpful, depending on the cleanliness of the data. And sometimes you find that there are actually a bunch of tables that aren't being used or aren't named correctly, and then it's a lot less helpful. But I still like to do this step. It still gives me a lot of information about the code base that will be helpful in the future for actually doing development work, or maybe even for doing cleanup work. The next thing to look at is the API and how the API is structured. I think it's great to just use a tool that will automatically generate API documentation for you. Most companies I work with will have this. Now, some frameworks have an API documentation tool built in, like Fast API with ships with Swagger. And for other frameworks, it's pretty easy to just install a library that will set it up with minimal configuration, and then it can read all your endpoints and then just generate the documentation for you. But again, most companies should already have that set up, and then you can just look at the interface to get the overview of what the API looks like. If they follow good naming conventions and RESTful standards, you should be able to look at the API docs and quickly pick out patterns and interact a little bit with the API inside of the interactive documentation. Now, the last part of the code base that I like to dive into is the UI, or the front end code. I think this is helpful to do in this order, because now when I get to the front end, after already looking at the database and the API, I can see what API calls are being made. And then I already have an understanding of what endpoints they might belong to, how those are structured, and then how the table relationships that they are querying, how those work. Now, around this time, as I'm diving into each part of the code base, of course, it's really helpful to be able to set up my local environment. Usually when I work at companies that already have a tool like Docker, it's pretty easy to set up a local environment. I just need to have Docker installed on my computer, and then I can hopefully just spin up the containers without external dependencies, maybe add an env or a config file, and things are good to go out of the box. Of course, it's not always as easy as that, but if there are extra complications or confusing things or missing steps in the documentation, I always make note of those and try to contribute a well-organized, thorough setup README to the code base. And a lot of times that is my first contribution at a new company or in a new code base, is adding some documentation about the setup and any nuances or issues you might run into and information around that. Another thing I want to add about diving into a new code base that I think is really crucial to onboarding is pairing with other developers who already have at least 3 to 6 months of experience working at that company. Pair programming is such a great tool for knowledge sharing and onboarding. If they don't offer that to you right away as part of onboarding with your mentor or with your seniors, I think you should absolutely ask for that. Some developers might not be comfortable with pair programming, so you might have to ask a few people. But in general, I found that most software developers do want to help other people on the team and do enjoy pair programming at least a percentage of their time. Step number 4 is to document and visualize the code base. I think a lot of people underestimate documentation as a tool for onboarding and learning a new code base, but I actually think it's one of the best ways to learn is to document as you go along. Every project you jump into is going to have different pieces of documentation that are missing, and most projects, from my experience, are poorly documented and somewhat confusing. Now, documentation can be in the form of adding doc strings to functions, classes, files that aren't clear. So the logic and maybe the inputs, outputs, etc. aren't clear from the naming conventions. And also, so often the business logic and user flows are not well documented or clearly organized. So that is an excellent piece of documentation to write. As part of documentation, I think some diagrams here are very useful. We already talked about ERDs for diagramming the database. I think architectural diagrams of how the systems work and the systems interact are super useful here as well. And even diagrams about user flows, they can really help solidify and clear up understanding around concepts. I did discover one tool recently that generates an interesting diagram of code bases, and I will link it below. It's called App Map. I've been testing it out recently, so I don't have too much experience with it, but I have found it to be useful. So you can check it out and also let me know if there are any other similar tools or other types of visual documentation like diagrams that you like to use. One thing I want to include in the documentation section here is making reference lists. These can be lists for you, or they can be included in whatever documentation solution you use, whether you do your documentation all in READMEs on GitHub, or you have some kind of tool like Confluence or Notion to house all of your company's documentation. The reference list can be important pieces of documentation, articles, where to find what, important links. Sometimes these are links to demo videos for a part of the product or for a workflow that you might not use that often, but you need to remember where it is sometimes. So I include those in reference lists, and sometimes I even set up, or for some things, I guess I set up Alfred workflows. So I just type in the keyword for that workflow and it opens up all of the browser tabs associated with whatever list that I want. Like if it's a DevOps reference list for doing things like setting up servers, doing database operations or configuration, whitelisting APIs, and all of those things, I have all of that reference documentation together and automated. A lot of people get confused about what type of documentation to write, or they feel overwhelmed or think, should I write documentation for every single part of the code base? So I just have a few quick tips of what types of documentation you can think about writing as you go through, in addition to what I've already mentioned. Of course, it's important to document anything that you found confusing for other people, because you're probably not the only one. Another really important thing to document: pieces of business logic or knowledge that is only in somebody's head. I see this a lot at startups where there will be somebody who's been there a long time or a co-founder, and they have all this business or domain knowledge and code-based knowledge, but it's just in their head. And they are the one that has to explain to every single new developer how something works, why it is that way. And also, they have to be asked about certain pieces of code that could be dead code or could be misnamed code or whatever, but they have to be asked every time, why is this here? What is it doing? Can we get rid of this, etc. So it's really great to document that, whether that's in the code or whether that's in some kind of business logic or user flow or whatever it might pertain to. Another important thing to document can be processes. So sometimes there are processes like the setup process for devs initially. It could be the process for generating a new migration or for running migrations on staging or whatever. But sometimes those processes are in everybody's head, but not written down anywhere. Those are things that could be referenced and looked up often. So processes like that are really nice things to have documented. And that's a good way to contribute documentation. Another thing that's important to document is any assumptions that are in people's heads. So while you're going through the code and you're learning from everybody else on the team, you'll find that certain assumptions are made, or there might be certain information that everybody knows because they've already been onboarded, but it's not clear to anyone who hasn't seen the code base before. Now, depending on your industry, sometimes it's really helpful to make lists of key terms that you use both internally in your team and maybe that the business uses, or even the larger industry. For example, the company that I work with right now is in the B2B marketing space, and we're in a specific niche within that space. So there is a lot of very particular terminology that I had no clue about before I started. And a lot of times that terminology is in people's heads, or people just know about it because they're experienced in the industry. But it's a super helpful thing as a reference list for yourself to go ahead and document that. And it's also helpful for other people at the company who might not know all of those terms. So I think it's good to split into two lists: the internal terms that you use at your company, and the second list are any industry terms that are commonly thrown around, especially abbreviations that not everybody might know about. Step 5 is to actually start getting your hands dirty and coding. So I like to give myself a challenge as part of onboarding. It kind of gamifies the process for me a little bit and gives me some kind of structure. For example, after looking at the application, I see some kind of dummy or fake feature that I could add. So I tried to add some kind of small front-end component or a page that's very, very minimal that makes a few API requests, and I go and make those endpoints and then make a new table and a migration that I could run against my local environment just to test things out. That's just a learning project that I can throw away. You could even get feedback from another developer to make sure that you are adhering to coding standards. I can read through the code for so long, but if I don't start actually building something and trying to implement something, then I don't get the full picture of what's going on. And I find that a test project is really helpful because there are no stakes involved. I can do it very quickly. It's just throwaway, and it's just kind of a learning and understanding project. So I play around with a lot of things just naturally. And it also gives me exposure to a lot of different parts of the code base across the whole stack. So some final thoughts. I just want to mention that every code base is unique. All of the steps and tips that I mentioned before don't have to be done in that particular order. Those are just things that I have learned over the years from practice and from advice that I've gotten from so many people and from reading books and other materials. It's very common to feel slow or to feel frustrated when you're starting out at a new company and you're trying to learn their code base and you feel like you just don't get it. So I can absolutely understand that and empathize with you. I think that having a plan of attack, practicing all of these things, and even practicing diving into code bases, even if you aren't starting at a new company, just taking an open source code base and practice going through it, trying to understand it, running it locally, all of those things will really help you in the future in your career. Sometimes you will run into poorly written code or very, very confusing code that's misnamed all over the place and so disorganized. And just remember that there's no reason to fault find or to say, how could you do this to another developer? You know, they did what they could in whatever situation they were working in based off of their own experience and skill set. So it's completely unhelpful to try to blame a developer who might have even worked in a different stage in the company where they didn't value the same kind of things. If you do have to jump into a dirty code base or a code base that needs some help with organization, etc., that's also a really good opportunity for you to learn to work in those systems and help to update and gradually improve them as you add new features and are doing your development work alongside. There's a few good books I recommend here. One that pretty much everyone probably recommends is Working with Legacy Code. I'll link a few other books in the description below. With that, I want to say thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something from this video. As always, if you have any questions or anything to add to what I've said here, please leave them in the comments below. If you have any books you recommend to go along with this material, I always love discovering and reading new books. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.